Interrupting.
Record on this computer.
Oh.
Go.
It said it started.
Oh, good.
Yep,
And
it's recording.
yay, and let's get our slideshow
I'm going
up
to
and running.
audio off because you'll hear my birds in the back.
I do hear you. It sounds great, but yeah, probably need to do the presentation instead of the chirping. Sounds so spring-like in your house.
Right, it is. Okay, I'm going to turn my audio off.
Okay, so season extension. So it's getting that time of year where we're all getting a little bit anxious to be able to get outside and get gardening. So I thought this would be a good topic to cover. And this is not only talking about getting out there a little earlier in the spring, but being able to go a little bit longer in the fall. And then if you really like leafy greens, growing all year round. So we'll cover it all. So season extension is actually not a new idea. This has been around basically since the beginning of time. Everyone's wanted to, have food access, especially those fresh vegetables, a little bit earlier. So here's a picture of an old-fashioned conservatory or greenhouse. A lot of these were built in the early 1800s. I think these cloches that are on this right-hand side with the guys, those are actually individually molded glass little greenhouses that they've individually put over every plant. So talk about, we feel good if we put a wall of water up, but they have, just imagine the expense to create all that glass to be able to keep those. And it looks like they're rolling back a fabric or a mat or a blanket off the top of them. So not only do they have the glass on there, but something that they would have to put on and remove every day. Some of your oldest versions of season extension are the hotbed. So this is showing straw bales with a glass window over the top, and usually they would fill this with compost or something to keep things heated. And I actually love this picture on the lower right. This is showing a little village that's all walled in. And they actually use those masonry walls as kind of heat sinks, and then they espaliered trees. So if you look at the walls, all the trees look kind of flat on there. Those are actually espaliered trees. So both apples and pears will espalier pretty nicely, and you can get a 2D shape with your cherry and your nectarine and your peach. They don't quite like to go clear across the wall like some of those show, but this idea of stretching the season has been around for a very long time, and we actually use many of the same methods. There are some new technologies out there, and we'll discuss that a little bit, but basically we're doing the same things now that they were doing back then to try to make the season start a little earlier and end a little later. So I really like this site. It's from davesgarden.com, and this is their freeze and frost dates. Now this is kind of like playing the lottery. You have a little bit of time to decide, when that last spring frost is coming. So generally in our area, if you're talking, Parma, Weiser, Emmett, that the rule of thumb is, a little bit before Mother's Day, you're probably okay. And if we look at that first line, temperature, spring, 32 degrees, if we wait till May 22nd, then we only have a 20% chance of frost. And if we wait till May 29th, then there's only a 10% chance of frost. So one thing that this also shows is just how much time we can back up if we can provide a little bit of frost protection. So if we can go down to, let's pay attention to the 50% line. So 50%, that 32 degrees is May 9th. If you can protect it to 28 degrees, you go to April 16th, and 24 degrees is March 29th. So you can back up quite a few weeks if you're able to provide 8 degrees of protection to that plant. So the same thing in the fall. If we're looking at an early frost, there's a 10% chance that we're going to have a 32-degree frost on September 16th. Oh, somebody's microphone might be on. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If someone wants to be sure they're muting. Looks like it might be you, Katie. There we go. All better. So if we look at the fall, the 24, 28, 32 there, so 32 degrees, there's a 10% chance on September 16th. And then a 90% chance that you're definitely going to have it by October 8th. And so what I like about this site is you can put in your zip code, and it gives you the nearest weather station. So this is Parma and Boise. And so if you're over in Emmett, it would probably pick up one in Emmett. So it gives you very local, and then not just a one day or a one number, but this whole range so you can make some decisions. So some of your cold tolerant crops, peas and your leafy greens, they're going to be able to go down to 24 degrees pretty easily. And so that's how you can plant those out, late March and usually be okay. Where your melons and your tomatoes don't even really like 32 degrees. They're pretty darn sensitive to frost. So you might want to wait till the May date on there. And I think it was Kathy Hill that told me one time that that people come and buy tomatoes 3 times at the thing. They start out in early April, and then there's another one later in April, and finally that last one that they purchase in May when it's finally time to put the tomatoes out. Okay, someone's calling. I'm hoping it's not one of my students, so I'm just going to keep going here. So another thing we have to watch for temperature.
That was happening.
Is the germination temperature. So certain crops need warm soil before they're going to come up, and other crops don't care so much. And some of them, if it gets too warm, you're not going to germinate either. So we'll kind of compare those. So tomatoes don't even like to begin until the soil is 60 degrees, and they're still going to have a low germination rate. And their ideal temperature is about 86 degrees, which may even be warmer than your house. So sometimes putting tomatoes on a heating mat will get them up and going a little bit faster. Now Swiss chard, on the other hand, is, it starts going about 50 degrees. It still likes it fairly warm. It'll go up to 86, and then it drops off pretty rapidly. You get much warmer than that, and it's going to start decreasing in germination. Well, spinach we consider a cool season crop, and it can start like 45 degrees, and its ideal is 70, and it's not even going to think about it for anything past 86 degrees. So not only do you have to meet air temperature needs, but if you're starting these seeds outside in your garden, you have to meet that soil temperature need too. And some of them, if you're going to try to put spinach in for fall planting, which is a common, overwintering crop, you generally have to wait till we get, almost into September to get that soil temperature down, because it tends to get pretty high in July and August, and your spinach won't want to germinate. So one of the benefits of knowing these dates and being able to stretch the season is succession planting. So this is getting more than one crop in a season from the same spot. So 2 or more crops in sequence, or to have something that you can eat all year. So it's great if you're canning, if you get everything comes in at once. But if you're wanting to snack on salads all season, you have to stretch out when that's available. So the first example on my picture is sweet corn. You could have an early planting or a late planting. So maybe you want sweet corn, you aren't planning on freezing it all or canning it all. You kind of like to have a couple ears throughout the season. Maybe every 2 weeks you'd go out and plant another row of sweet corn so that you could have. Might have a little bit challenge. They are actually wind pollinated. So you have to have a plot of sweet corn. 3 sweet corn plants generally have a little bit of a hard time getting pollinated. Maybe you could grow interval succession planting. So the same crop at time intervals is kind of what we did with sweet corn. 2 or more crops in sequence would be maybe getting an early thing of spinach started and going, and then putting your tomato seedlings right next to them. And so you'd harvest and take that spinach out before the tomato gets up and going. One other example here is of interplanting is maybe you could put carrots interplanted with radishes. So radishes are probably one of your fastest crops. They can be 30 to 45 days from seed to ready to come out of the ground. Well, carrots are kind of more of a long-term crop. And they kind of have the same requirements when you're trying to get the seeds germinated. So you could plant a row of carrots with a row of radishes right beside it or in between. And you can pick and have the radishes out of there before the carrots need the room. Lettuce and herbs are another ones that interplant really well. They recommend radish and scallions could be an example. So here they have like bush yellow snap beans followed by a half row of chard and a half row of lettuce. So if you were got, you know, a crop that can go in that mid-May season, maybe it's off and done by late August, early September, maybe you could sneak in another crop of snap beans or another crop of chard or lettuce. So these are just all those different ideas of how you can do succession planting. Sometimes this is a little bit hard with crop rotation. You know, if you're growing 3 or 4 different crops in a raised bed, then you are getting different crops in there. It'll definitely confuse the pests. And you're in there enough, you probably won't have trouble with weeds, but it might be hard to, you know, not use anything in the nightshade family for a whole year if your succession planting is including tomatoes or peppers. So this does play some havoc with your crop rotation, but a good way to get lots of crop in a small space. So we're going to talk about all these different structures that you can use for season extension. So cold frames, hotbeds, some of the individual plant protection things you can do, mini hoops, frost cloth, hoop houses, and greenhouses. And I'll actually bring some examples of frost cloth and some of the hoop house plastic, and we'll do some experiments to see how warm it gets inside depending on what material you use. So the cold frame is actually a pretty easy thing to build and operate. One of the challenges is, unless you're going to install a window lifter in it, is you kind of need to be home. I have 5 or 6 cold frames in my backyard that I built. I have a picture of them coming up next. But the challenge is I'm no longer home where that I can lift and lower those windows. And so it actually gets really hot inside if the window's down. And if the wind picks up, it'll toss your windows down the driveway if you're not careful. So a little bit of challenges with running them if you're not home to babysit. They should have a southern exposure to receive the maximum amount of light. And to reduce the cost of heating, if you use a north or a northwest windbreak. It's really amazing how much heat is taken out of some of these season structures by the wind. It can really cool things down. Another thing I had a challenge with is a convenient water supply. So I had my little cold frames out there, and at the time I had some greens growing in them. And if it was a stretch of decent weather, I'd put the tomatoes out there. But my hoses were still freezing, so I'd go out to water, and the hose was all frozen, and so then I wouldn't water, and I'd forget later in the day. So water supply at this time of year sometimes gets to be a challenge. So up on the left-hand side, I don't think you'd ever mistake my house from the one in the bottom corner, but just in case, there's some examples of the cold frames I have. I actually used aluminum windows, which don't have as much insulation factor to them, but a lot of your modern windows have UV protection on them. And that UV protection keeps it from heating up or the light getting through to your plants. So actually the old style windows are a little bit better to use for that. And here I had the windows, and then underneath the frost cloth, and that's tomatoes that sat under there. And then the little stick is what I used to prop up my windows. And this is when I just ripped the grass out of my backyard that fall. So we've got a lot of bare ground. And I had this nice slope. We, have that concrete ditch bank sitting there. So it was pointed south and just the perfect angle. So I made the best of that. And those sticks would be those were ornamental sunflowers that I grew in the back. So they were single stock sunflowers. And now I have a whole line of hollyhocks there. And they perform a little bit more of a windbreak. And my mother-in-law's house is just on the other side of that field. So that's why we try to keep some sort of large planting there so she doesn't have to see me in my backyard. On this right-hand bottom photo, this is from the 1970s. This is Louis Sevier's farm. And you can see he has this big fancy greenhouses. but it explained in the writing of that surrounded this picture is that he would take everything out of the greenhouses and in and out of those cold frames before they'd be ready to go out into the field. So one of the big challenges, if something's been grown in a protected environment and you pop it out and stick it outside on a nice, freezing day with wind, that plant is going to be very, very sad. So a lot of the times they'll get sunburned. So they aren't used to the UV light that's being provided, especially if they've been inside or in a low light environment in a hoop house. And then they're not really used to the wind. So the wind will break their stems. So putting them in the hoop house and then taking them out to these cold frames and toughing them up a little bit is how that system worked. And I think that's a pretty good idea for most plants, kind of transition them from one environment to the next. So I actually had to try this too, and this was all before I worked full-time, so that gave me some options to try these things. So a hotbed is basically your cold frame structure, but you provide heat underneath. And that heat can be provided by a soil heating cable. So this is something that they had running at Andrew Seed when I went past one time. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool and kind of a new modern thing. So it's just an electrical heating cable, similar to what you'd use to keep your pipes from freezing in the winter, except it's made just for gardening. And it's got a little thermostat on it that anytime it gets below 40 degrees, it turns on. So it's enough to keep your cool season vegetables going. And you're actually supposed to lay that out and then put a little layer of sand or soil on top and then just plant directly above that heating cable. So one trouble I had, and I also have, I live on a dairy, so I had the manure, so I tried the traditional hotbed with putting fresh manure to decompose underneath. And they both worked fairly well, except once again I had trouble with water. Between the heat coming through the glass and the heat coming up, it would dissipate moisture really, really quickly, and I had trouble keeping the plants wet enough. So I'd get things germinated and just going and skip a day of watering, and it was all over with. They'd be wilted and dead when I went back to check on them. So that's one thing, having good access to water at that early season. Because I think when I tried the hotbeds, I think I was going for late February, early March, and it was hard to keep them wet. So sometimes you are just trying to protect an individual plant. This seems to be mostly done for tomatoes. We all would like the most tomatoes, the earliest that we can get. If we can get them before July 4th, the happier we are. So a lot of you are familiar with wall of waters, and these actually work super well. So water takes a lot of energy to go from liquid to solid and freezing. So these actually provide you a lot of frost protection. The only problem is that tomatoes, you give them that warm environment, they really get up and going. So anything that's up out of the top of your wall of water is still susceptible to frost. So the pictures, or the plants in this picture, are kind of at risk here. You might lose that top. And the plant will keep growing if you lose that top portion to frost, but they tend to get really branchy and are difficult to cage later on if you frosted the tops of them. Speaking from experience, we've tried that. Some of the wall of waters will actually let you close the top in kind of a teepee formation, and that works pretty good. And walls of water actually work good for melons and zucchinis, but they grow so fast that if they get warm enough in that wall of water, they'll outgrow the wall of water, and then you're kind of stuck, because if the frost comes and they're sticking their little leaves out, they're going to get frosted. The picture on the right that looks like a whole set of multicolored ghosts is they've actually put their bed sheets over their large tomato cages. And I thought that was first of all, I don't think I have that many sheets in my house. They really have a nice selection of sheets. Maybe they went to the DI or the thrift store and picked those up just for that purpose. But just a heavy cotton sheet will provide you a couple degrees of frost protection. Down on the bottom left, those are actually styrofoam hot caps, which can be reused from year to year and provide a little bit of frost protection. And then on the ones on the right are actually a wax paper frost cap. And you actually kind of bury the edges in the ground. And with with the sheets and all these frost cap methods, wind tends to be an issue. We kind of have a moody spring around here and things get blown around. So staking down whatever frost protection you have is usually pretty important. On one hand, usually when you have a lot of wind, sometimes you don't have that frost event. It doesn't get very cold. It's on the still nights that you really have to worry. So as long as you can go gather them off the fence and put them back on your plants before the frost, it might not be too bad if they blow in the wind. So this is my favorite stuff ever. This is floating row cover, and it's actually a like a polyester fabric, and it comes in different weights. So, and I put some prices up here. This was from a couple years ago from Johnny Seeds. And I think you can get it locally now. I think you can get just a small sheet at Andrew's Seed that's like a 10 by 10, but it's like $12. So it's better if you're going to buy it to go ahead and buy in a large quantity. So like a 10-foot by 50-foot sheet at Johnny Seed was $29. And if you plan on using a lot of it, that 500-foot roll will last you a very, very long time. So this stuff just lays over the top of your plants. As you see on the left-hand side, if you're not, like if you're in a hoop house or a greenhouse, that's a good way. You don't have to worry about the wind inside of those structures. You can just lay it right on your plants. Or you can make little wire hoops and then use it like a greenhouse fabric over the top. So this provides some of them can provide up to 8 degrees of frost protection. It depends on the weight that you choose. So I think this Ag 19 is a little bit lighter one. If I remember right, it provided like 4 degrees of frost protection. But in our area, not only frost protection, it provides a little bit of wind protection too. So it is porous, so water and air can go through, but it definitely slows down the wind as it's coming through. It's also good for early season insects. So if you get, what do they call them? Little black jumpy guys in your spinach, flea beetles. If you get flea beetles really bad, you can just leave the cover on and then just pull it up and harvest and put the cover right back down and actually leave it on all season for your leafy green crops to keep your flea beetles off. So the stuff has a lot of different purposes beyond season extension. So you can even go up another side. These are called quick hoops. These can be made out of PVC. If you are going to use PVC in the garden, and we'll talk a little more when we talk about hoop houses, PVC does break down in the sun, so it'll get really brittle with exposure to UV light. So I've actually seen people take out spray paint cans and spray paint their PVC with a white, either latex or oil-based paint, just to prevent it from breaking down in the sun. So it's one extra step, but PVC is a pretty cheap material to work with. I've actually done hoops like this with electrical conduit tubing. So it's metal tubing. A 10-foot length is usually about $2.50 at Home Depot. So you can cut it in half and bend it and have 2 hoops for a pretty affordable price. They also have, I've seen this done with wire. So just a heavy duty wire bent over. And then to hold down your things, they have sandbags on these, but I've also seen people do stakes and string to hold down their quick hoops. But these are meant to go over a single or a double row and just gives you that frost protection and wind protection and possibly insect protection. Here they're using frost cloth. If you need a little bit more protection, you can actually use a greenhouse plastic and do that from year to year. So temperature control is kind of what we're after. So during extremely cold weather, provide extra protection and conserve heat by covering the sash with mats or a layer of straw. So if we're talking about our cold frames or our hot beds, if you have a blanket or a layer of mulch or straw that you could put on them if there's just some unseasonably one cold night that you're trying to get through. On warm sunny days, you can remove the window or the sash and open it wide or totally remove it. It's amazing on a clear sunny day just how much heat can build up in these structures. And since they are solely dependent on natural heat absorbed during the day, you can't be too late at night to close them. So sometimes we'll have this beautiful, 75-degree day, and you've got everything open. And you get busy in the day, and time change happens, and you get later in the night, and then it's like 6:30, and you're like, oh, I forgot to close my windows or put the cover back down, and that can really risk having them frost in the morning. So you got to get that sash down and let them heat up a little bit in the evening, without getting that excess temperature buildup. So it's kind of a hit and miss. You kind of have to learn how to work with these cold frames and hotbeds. So here's some unique pictures of the thing. So this one, not only they made the structure of their hoop house using wire, and that kind of looks like maybe hog panel wire to me, or cement reinforcing wire is a little bit easier to bend into that shape. But they've actually used old-fashioned Christmas lights. So your non-LED big bulb lights actually put off quite a bit of heat. So they actually use that as their frost protection. Plus, look how pretty it is. You've got a little Christmas lasting on. On that top right, that would be like an insulated blanket that they're using. And then in the bottom picture, you can see all that plastic kind of rolled up on the bottom. So they would pick up that black plastic and blanket and roll it back up over their cold frame to provide some protection. So just some ideas. Everybody gets really creative.
Tessa?
Yes.
Being out here in Emmett, we had the fruit trees in our backyard, and I strung my Christmas tree lights in the fruit trees to keep them warm enough so they would not freeze and I'd have fruit. So it works.
Oh, good. And good idea with the fruit trees. That's a perfect idea.
Okay.
Yeah, now that they're going to this LED non-heating light, you need to hold on to those old-fashioned Christmas lights so they put out some heat and do the job. So automatic vent openers, these actually work on a wax cylinder, and they don't require any batteries or electricity. And you can you can turn them and adjust them so that they start opening about 60 to 77 degrees, fully open around 90, and then fully closed at about 55. And my prices are about 2 years old, but you could get one for $70 at Farm Tech, and then like $40 at Grow Organic. And you really have to read how much weight they're willing to lift. So if you got a flimsy aluminum window, it'll probably lift a fairly big window. But if you've got glass and glazing and 2x4s, then you're going to have to size up or use two of them to get it to open. But if I wanted to still use my cold frames, this would be something that would save me if I had to go to work each day. So I haven't got to try one of these out in person, but I thought they were a nifty idea. So hoop houses. I used to have a hoop house. In fact, I'm still trying to decide what I'm going to do with that piece of land since mine did collapse last winter. I was so proud of it. It made it to, I think it had 2 full feet on the top of it and maybe 4 feet along the side before it even started to sag. But once we went to 4 feet accumulation, it didn't have a hope. Hoop houses tend to be much more affordable than a greenhouse. That's what kind of initially attracted me to them, as I really wanted an enclosed space to grow in, and this was the cheapest way to do it. You can build them yourself. So, I do have an engineering background, and my dad used to be a carpenter, so I have a few skills, but I was able to build my hoop house. My husband would come out and help me about a half hour. He is a dairyman. That's about all the time I get. So about a half hour every day, all the way through spring break, and we got it put up. It has a lot of advantages on our windy and dry climate. My initial thought is like, I'm going to have to water in there all the time because it's going to be hotter. But having that plastic cover actually kept in the moisture and didn't have the wind. And it's amazing what plants will do if they're not being beaten to death by the weather. So not only did it provide temperature control, but just that protection was great. I really recommend, there's this book by Lynn Baczynski. It's kind of hard to read her name down there, and I don't know if I could spell it even if I could read it. But she does a newsletter called Growing for Market, and she has the Hoop House Handbook. And if you're interested in this or learning more about this, that's definitely a recommended book. And I'll have a few more books as we go along here. So here's my hoop house. It actually makes me kind of sad now that it no longer exists, but I had this chunk of property that was between the RV shed and my house, and once again along that concrete ditch bank, and never mind the kochia and prickly lettuce skeletons that you see in the background. So this was my hoop house. It was 20 feet wide by 30 feet long, and those posts are made out of the top railing of chain link fence. And that actually can be purchased at Home Depot or Franklin Building Supply, or they're locally sourced, and they are, if I remember right, less than $1 a foot. So they're pretty affordable to work with. I got all the little connections at the top. Those are kind of a special order item. So I found a greenhouse supply catalog and ordered in all those connections to put my purlins in. And I made some decisions to make it so that it would last in the weather. So each hoop was only 4 feet apart. And some of the drawings and stuff, I said they put them almost 8 feet apart. But the more wind you have and the more snow load you want to carry, the closer you want each hoop. And also the purlins, I could have chose to only put these top rails, purlins, I could have chose to only put one down the middle, but I put 2 on the sides too, and that gave it a lot more rigidity in the weather. I also chose to make some solid post for the end walls, and actually both ends of my hoop house are still standing. So these posts held, I just lost the very middle. So I guess if I wanted to rebuild, I would only need to rebuild the middle part. So both ends, one end's leaning just slightly, but they really held up to the weather. Oh, and then you want to choose boards that aren't going to decay with weather. So these are cedar boards, and I just happened to be on Craigslist, and someone was getting rid of a whole bunk of, these were actually, they couldn't be used for decking because they had some splits and knots in it, and I didn't really care to use it for my hoop house, so that saved me a little bit of money there. I was able to build and plastic this whole thing for a little bit under $700, which is way, way cheaper than a greenhouse of the same size. So when I was pricing greenhouses of this size, they were wanting between $4,500 and $7,000. So my poor budget couldn't handle quite that much. So here's inside after I first got it up. And hoop houses you generally grow in the ground instead of up on racks. And so really improving the soil before you put up the hoop house is one recommendation. I wish I would have done a little bit more work on my soil. This was actually where my husband had like his burning barrels and stuff. So there was some broken glass and some metal in there that I would have preferred not to be digging my hands through. Hindsight's 20/20. I actually put roll-up sides on this. It's kind of hard to see. So there's a board along about 2-3 feet up on the wall, and the plastic actually rolls up from the bottom up to that board. So I can open up both sides. And then there's 3 windows on this end, and then I had a door and 2 windows on the other end. I'll show you that picture in a second. I was talking to Ann and Jeff about using Hortanova netting. So this is Hortanova netting that I have put on electric conduit tubing framework. So, and this year I grew my tomatoes up through that netting, and it worked okay. I had to be out there quite often poking it through the netting and pulling it back through. It didn't naturally weave itself through the webbing. I planted my tomatoes a little too close that year. I think I grew 40-some tomatoes, so I was trying to shove as many as I could into the hoop house. I think I ended up with 8 of these on each side, so not a lot of spacing there. But this is a year I did the farmer's market in Boise, and I didn't have tomatoes anywhere but the hoop house, and I supplied my whole farmer's market booth out of 2 rows of tomatoes out of the hoop house. So they were super productive. I was really lucky there. So here's another picture. So there's my other side looking back towards the doors and windows. Another thing to think of is what are you going to want to bring into the hoop house? So luckily I made it just so my Rubbermaid cart would go through that door. So that's how I decided how big my door was going to be. I made the door like a split barn door so that I could open up the top one as a window if I needed to, and not let the kids or the dogs into my hoop house. So that's kind of another design feature. You'll also see, like on the right-hand side from the soil up to the top, like a small wire. So I was really afraid that this was going to blow away. So one of the biggest hazards with the hoop house is having them pick up like a kite and end up, 100 feet away from where you want them to be. So that's aircraft cable and mobile home anchors. So it wasn't going anywhere. So no worries about it flying away. If I was going to design for more snow load, I probably would have taken my pressure-treated beams and put some in the middle of the hoop house. Another design flaw I had is I ended up building another little hoop house right next to this, and that didn't allow the tractor to be able to get all the way around this hoop house. So it actually caved in from the sides because I wasn't able to remove the snow efficiently when we had 4 feet of snow off the side. So it actually held vertically pretty well. It got kind of shoved in horizontally. So here's pictures of not mine. This is Elliot Coleman. He's pretty famous for his ability to do 4-season gardening. He's based in Maine, so actually at a higher latitude than we are, and he grows year-round. So here's some pictures of his gigantic hoop houses. And I just love how orderly and precise all of his rows and raised beds are. So that's definitely something to aspire to. And he must be more flexible than me because those are little tiny rows and alleys between his growing beds. So he's really maximized the space. But I think my garden cart would wipe out part of the beds if I had that design. So he has this other amazing idea, and I'm not sure how well it would work in our Idaho weather. But this is a movable, slidable hoop house. So he's put on one end, so let's say you're trying to protect tomatoes or peppers. So you plant all your tomatoes and peppers, and you put the plastic over the hoop house. But then later in the season, mid-season, it's plenty warm. You don't need protection for your peppers anymore. He actually slides it down the rail, so pulls all of that, all of those bows are on wheels, and slides it down and plants a new crop in the next spot. So something that maybe he's going to take into the fall and want to last longer in the fall. So I thought that was really unique because these structures are kind of expensive to build, of a way you could use it for 2 different spots. As I said, I'm not sure that this would be wind tolerant enough for the weather that we get. So then when you have extreme weather, and this might be looking to my poor New Meadows people, sometimes 2-3 different layers of season extension can be used together. So this is a hoop house with cold frames on the inside, and if you wanted to go one step further, you could throw some frost cloth underneath the cold frame and really take an advantage. But this just is another example of ingenuity in a way that when it's really cold outside, that you probably could still get a crop off. So this is Elliot Coleman. I mentioned his name, and he has this book, The Winter Harvest Handbook. And you have to get kind of used to eating pretty healthy food. So, he's growing cold-tolerant crops, so a lot of leafy greens. You get a little bit of carrots and radish in there as well. But an interesting thought, we have basically 6 months out of the year that we're able to eat out of the garden, and being able to stretch that a little farther could be great. Plus you'd eat all those healthy vegetables. And then he's doing this in unheated greenhouses, so you're not using any fuel, or it's not costing you anything beyond the structure to keep these going. So the 3 basic components of his system is you're choosing cold hardy vegetables, and you're actually growing them in the fall and then basically cold storing them over the winter. So because of the light, you don't get a lot of growth as you go into November, December, and January. So this is his selection of cold hardy vegetables, and as I said, a pretty healthy choice of vegetables. You've got spinach, chard, carrots, scallions, corn mosh. If you haven't seen that, that's actually a really early season, pretty good little green. Claytonia and arugula. You can do beet greens, broccoli rabe, carrots, chicory, kale, kohlrabi, lettuce, pak choi, radish, and turnips. He does a little bit of succession planting in this, so sowing more than once a season because he's wanting to harvest throughout the winter. And the big thing is just protecting them from a hard frost. So you don't want to get these guys much below 24 degrees. So this got a little fuzzy in the copy and pasting, but this is the harvest season of cold house crops from October to May, and he's in zone 5, which we're actually considered zone 6, even though I try to lean more towards zone 5. So as you can see, in October, he's harvesting everything, and most everything but celery in November. And then it starts to drop off a little bit. You'll lose some of your radishes and your endive. And the radish mostly is because it's only a 30, 60-day crop to begin with, and you won't be able to get the seed to germinate a second time when you're going into December. And then if you look, his spinach, sorrel, tatsoi, lettuce, mosh, mizuna, green onions, he's doing those all the way through the winter. So it's just interesting to see the availability that you could have there. So this one's a little hard to explain. So this is lower light levels and lower temperature on a crop. So this crop would normally take 40 days from seed to harvest. So this might be something like a green or a radish. The curves show the increasing and decreasing number of days to harvest from fall through winter. So the crops aren't going to move as fast in their growth. So let's say, and this is cool house versus cold house. So a cool house, I think he believes never gets under about 35, 40 degrees. And the cold house is just left to whatever temperature it becomes outside. So you can see here that it's just taking a longer time, number of days from planting to harvest. So let's say you planted it, let's pick something, December 26th. So the day after Christmas, you decided you're going to go stick some greens out there. And it says here you would, on the cool house, be able to harvest on March 7th, and that's about 70 days. And in the cold house, you wouldn't be able to harvest till April 14th, and that's more in the 105, 110 days. So that's something you have to consider if you're doing this kind of growing, is it's going to take a little bit longer for that crop to finish, just because of the low light and the low temperature. Another misconception is that we're trying to even out the temperature with these methods. And so this is an example of if one of his hoop houses, and the red line is inside the greenhouse under that frost cloth fabric, and the blue is outside the greenhouse. So as you can see, he was reaching above 70 degrees a couple times. In fact, in February, he got up to 91 degrees. I'm guessing a fan or something didn't open up that was supposed to. I don't think you really want to put these cool season crops in a 100-degree greenhouse. But the important part is that when it was negative 2.6 outside on January 30th, it was 23.5 degrees inside that greenhouse. So as I said, that 24, 28 degrees, if you only do it one night, they're probably going to be okay. So you're still having a lot of temperature fluctuation with the weather. You're just trying to take out that low bottom out of it. And then you're actually wanting to prevent those really high temperatures as well. Okay, so let's talk about your traditional greenhouse. Generally, these are heated. So there's a lot of different heating methods. Propane is probably one of the most common in our area. If you're close enough to town to have natural gas, that'd be a little bit more affordable. I have seen people heat with wood heat. You have to be a little bit careful with wood heat. The carbon monoxide that sometimes builds up in your stove system will need to be vented out of your greenhouse. It can actually cause plant damage, the carbon monoxide can, much alone human damage if you're in there for too long. A traditional greenhouse generally needs to have ventilation. So they're completely sealed up. So if you do get a bright sunny day with no wind, they heat up a lot. So you'll generally need to have some windows or some vents and fans. In the summer, you're actually cooling these greenhouses, so they'll have kind of a swamp cooler system. So big wetted pads and fans that blow and cool the greenhouse. And you're usually not growing in the ground. You usually have some sort of benches. Your glazing is usually glass or polycarbonate. Usually when you're going to all the trouble to put in the heating and the cooling, you want to have a little bit of protection there. They generally don't use that greenhouse plastic. You're usually getting something a little bit thicker with a little bit more insulation value. Sometimes people will add lighting to their greenhouse. So we live at a northern latitude, and actually the amount of light that we have in the winter is pretty limiting for growing anything but grains. If you want a fruiting crop or a flowering crop, you're basically going to need to provide supplemental light. And this is way beyond like our seed starting shop lights. So these are usually high pressure sodium lights that can be fairly expensive. So you have to be growing a pretty valuable crop to make the lighting worth it. And these can be a significant investment, but they're really, really cool. You get to garden all year round. You have control of that temperature. There's plants that you can keep in there that you wouldn't be able to keep other places. So maybe you have an avocado or a citrus plants or flowers that would only grow in the south. It could be your little retreat in there. So here's some innovative ideas for greenhouses. And me and Melissa Hamilton, she's our extension educator in McCall, we really want to build one of these. So we are currently on the search for grants. We actually have a professor in the architecture department who has helped us design one of these and figure out the calculations for the angle for putting the plastic on. So these are called Wallapinis is their name. Sometimes they're called Chinese greenhouses. So they actually have the back wall is usually masonry or brick or stone, so something that's going to store a bunch of heat. They're usually buried in the ground, so this back side is going to be buried under the soil. So you have this huge insulation factor on one side of your greenhouse. And then the other side is angled just right to catch all of that southern winter sun. And so these are, you can grow in them year-round if you've got it designed just perfectly. And so we really want to try this out and see if we can make it work. I don't know of any of these locally. We did have a master gardener in Ada County that had an itty-bitty teeny-weeny one. I'd say hers was maybe 8 feet wide by 8 feet long. So pretty small example. But I went to her house in January, and she had kale in there and some cabbage, and some cool season crops that she had held all winter long in that design. Sometimes you'll see these advertised. So this is a geodesic dome, and I think for being able to stand up and this is more of an experience. So your growing area versus your glazing area is a little rough on this. So you don't have as much growing room on the inside for all this structure that you've built, but it's just really cool on the inside. So if you're building your greenhouse just to keep seasonal depression at bay, this might be your best idea. So the geodesic dome is actually structurally pretty sound. So this would be good for high wind areas or high snow load areas. This dome is a pretty good structure. And I'd like to see how tall you could get a tomato in there. I bet it would be pretty impressive. So every time you look on Craigslist, I always see old windows available for greenhouses. And I found this picture, and I thought it described what mentally people are thinking. So it can actually be really hard to use old windows for a full greenhouse. First of all, they come in all different sizes and all different thicknesses. So you really have to have some artistic design there. You still have the roof issue. Are you going to try to make an angled roof out of your glass design? You still have to be able to vent it. So even though I think everyone always thinks, I'm going to save these old windows and make myself a greenhouse. I think this picture kind of illustrates some of the challenges that you might face in using old windows. But if you can put it together as nicely as this guy does, more power to you, you know. Recycle as much as you can. So this is my last slide, and I would say this is kind of my dream. You know, if I didn't have to actually make a living and all I could do was garden, this is what I want. So this is Elliot Coleman's place in Maine. He obviously has a lot of employees, obviously not doing this himself, but just beautiful pictures. And look how evenly spaced all of his little lettuce plants are, and his aisles don't have any weeds in them, and he has the hoop house in the background, and a country estate. So I think season extension is a big part of having this ideal scenario. And you know what? It is perfectly fine if you want to start gardening on May 15th and be done on October 1st. And I see a lot of gardeners that are actually in that thing. By the time you get to the fall, you're really quite ready to be done. And then there's others that, you know, wish we wouldn't have to stop and wish we could keep going. So the season extension choices are varied there. But I also want to say there is definitely a benefit for having a structure that you can plant in. I know, you know, I only had weekends off, and of course it would always wind and rain, and it would be horrible on the weekend, and all I wanted to do is garden. Well, inside my hoop house, there was no wind and there was no rain, and I could piddle around in there in March and April until I could get outside. And I think it provided just as much, you know, mental benefit as it ever did food benefit. So if you can talk your significant other into spending the money on a greenhouse, good luck to you. Okay, so I'll open it up for questions. This is the end of my actual presentation, and we got just a few minutes here. So anybody have questions about season extension or greenhouses or hoop houses? And you could type those into chat or turn on your microphone, whatever works best for you.
I have a question.
Yes.
I noticed in your hoop house you had some hay on the ground in there. So how do you filter that in? Like when, or do you mulch it in the soil?
So yeah, I put that down. It was kind of muddy in there. I'd let some irrigation get out of control. I was still working on my drip system and it pulled apart. I didn't want to walk through the mud. We live on a dairy farm, so I have that. And that's actually hay that's been eaten by the cows. That's all the stems that they've kicked out. So luckily no weed seeds or anything. So I put that in the alley, and it actually did last me most of the season. And at the end of the season, I actually ended up raking it out and putting it out in my compost pile. They said it was really skinny. I think it would have taken a long time to actually break down in the soil, but just trying to reuse what I had to make it work.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hey, Montessa, I was just wondering how you bent your posts when you made your hoop house.
So she asked how I bent my post for my hoop house, and there's a couple companies that sell benders, and they're actually made out of kind of the same material that you're bending. So they come, they're about 5 or 6 feet long, and you stick one end and then pull. And so on a 12-foot one, I actually had my master gardeners. It took 2 or 3 of them pulling on it to get it to bend. But as a couple of weak females that don't do CrossFit or anything, we were able to get them bent on our own. But yeah, the benders, and I actually have a 12-foot and a 20-foot bender. So if anyone wants to borrow it, if you've got construction in mind, I'd be happy to loan those out.
So what does that mean, a 12-foot or a 20-foot bender?
So that's either for a 12-foot wide hoop house or a 20-foot wide hoop house. So you have to buy the bender for the width of hoop house, and then you can go as long as you want, just depending on how many hoops you want.
Well, I might take you up on borrowing that one of these days, because my husband needs another project, right?
There you go. There you go. I actually had mine attached. Helps if you like screw it into a piece of plywood. And I accidentally left my piece of plywood outside too long. So the last time I went to bend, it came off of its plywood base. And so I need to put it back on there. But actually it's great. Now it's easier to move and someone else can stick it on a piece of plywood. But it works quite well. You have to watch a little bit that if you accidentally roll the pipe while you're bending, then you get a spiral instead of a hoop. And that doesn't work so well for construction, but I only did that with one. I learned my lesson, and then I was good from there on out. So, any other questions?
Tessa, this is Jan.
Yes.
The thickness of the, I'm going to say, is it plastic you put on your hoop house? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you want to, I see some people go and get like painter's plastic from Home Depot, and that's not going to last you even part of a month in our system. So this is greenhouse plastic. The one I chose was 4 millimeters thick. You can get 6 mil plastic. It's rated for about 4 years. So about every 4 years, it starts to break down. Even with the UV coating on it, it starts to break down a little bit. The horrible thing is my hoop house was at 4 years, and when it was going down in the snow, I should have went and cut the plastic. And so I saw on the news like a day later that that's what they done at some of the organic farms in the valley, is just go cut the plastic off of them. And that probably would have saved my hoop house, and I needed new plastic anyway. The plastic can be really expensive just because I haven't found a good local source for the big plastic. So you can get about 10 feet wide locally. But I needed, 20, 30 feet wide to go over that hoop house. And so the shipping to get it to you is what cost the most. So the plastic itself was about $450. And I said the whole hoop house was $700. So that was a lot of the cost. Okay, guys, well, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. We actually got it recorded, and I got the PowerPoint to you ahead of time, and hopefully I can get it correctly posted on YouTube. And, I think we're on week 7 or 8. I'm getting this figured out. So I will send out a list tomorrow morning of how much soil to bring and what soil to bring for our thing on Friday from noon to 6 for my Jim County. And Ann and Jeff, we already saw you just a week or so ago. So, and then our next meeting after that will be the 23rd and the 24th. So 23rd for Jim County and 24th for my New Meadows people. So the plan for the 23rd and 24th is we'll be doing everything integrated pest management. So that's when you'll learn the entomology and the weeds and all these things that annoy us. So this weekend will be soils and fruit and season extension and still all the fun stuff. We'll save all the aggravation for the end. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Monteza. See you later.
Thanks, Tessa.
See ya.
Bye.
Thank you.